Hello and welcome to this latest edition of Whether or Not. I'm meteorologist Brian Karstens and hope you are having a great Tuesday. It is a fair weather day, literally, and I guess as we look at the weather forecast fitting for the Turner County Fair, we've got temperatures in the 80s, and it looks like the worst of the heat avoiding us, at least for today and this afternoon. All right, well, let's begin today's program. Just a couple of words here about the weather forecast, and obviously we like to do that kind of to kick things off here as far as where we've been and where we're going. Yesterday, we had a warm day out there, hot in central South Dakota, 90-degree weather, returned to Pierre and Winter and Rapid City. But today's forecast has cooled off. We had a cold front that crossed through the area last evening. We ended up tracking a few thunderstorms across areas north of Sioux Falls. The Watertown area picked up around a half an inch of rainfall with some of that activity. But that front, for the most part, pretty weak here. We didn't have a lot of instability ahead of that, so we did end up with one warning there in and around just west of Brookings, but for the most part, we didn't have to address that subject of widespread severe weather, which, of course, after what we've experienced, we're pretty happy about that. It's been a kind of an active cycle of weather, obviously. But the question is, are we going to return to the conversation about heat and humidity and storms? And I think that the short answer is yes, there will be some of that. So coming up, we're going to be discussing the big picture of what's going on in the world of weather. Stay with us. You're watching Whether or Not, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Whether or Not. I'm meteorologist Brian Karstens. Thank you for watching. Well, on today's show, we're going to talk about the forecast and more details and some of the behind-the-scenes things that we've been watching. I wanted to begin here with a couple of live, or at least one camera shot. This is from Parker from earlier today. And what's really interesting here, obviously, the amount of smoke in this air this summer. We've had several days of smoke descending from Canada. It was an issue that we really dealt with yesterday, and still as of this morning, too. The hazy skies there as you look across the areas, or the rural areas there outside of Parker, just as an example of what we were tracking this morning. The one good piece of news here in the forecast is that the smoke is expected to decrease here somewhat. Let me take you to the smoke forecast. This is the animation that basically dictates or depicts some of the areas of plumes of smoke descending from those wildfires. And you can see on the maps there by 6 o'clock this evening, we're still dealing with some of it, so we can't erase the story entirely, but the story is definitely thicker to our northwest. And obviously, that's where some of this air is coming from initially in the forecast the next 12 to 18 hours. But as we transition into Wednesday, notice what's going on here. We've got a switcheroo in the wind, and that will help to move that smoke probably a little bit to our north. And that's going to come in with the fact that we've got air out of the desert southwest. Some of that's just going to be plain hot, dry air moving into southwest South Dakota. For others in eastern Kettleland, it's going to be more humidity. So instead of seeing haze from smoke, we're going to see haze just by the humidity alone. That will be a factor. But I do want to play that out for you so you know kind of the trends there. And some of you are obviously more particular about this subject as the smoke, when it gets to the point where you can smell it in the air, not only just seeing it, but smelling it, it is an effect here on our health, too. So we're mindful of that. We've had several air quality alerts from Minnesota, and even into early Thursday, it looks like Minnesota, Wisconsin still going to deal with that subject more. Another subject we'll address here as we kind of entertain the idea of more humidity moving in. This is the latest dew point forecast. And as we start things off, we're in pretty good shape here. We don't really have a lot of depth of humidity in the air. Dew points this afternoon have been in the 50s, which in my view is always a more comfortable air mass. But the fact of the matter is it's going to change. It's August, and once we start to roll in with this southeasterly wind, we are going to shake things up here a little bit. And look at the difference by Thursday. This is quite telling. When you see Hot Springs, Martin, and Wall, dealing with dew points in the near 50 degrees. Let's just say, for argument's sake, it's even 55. Could be lower than 50, actually. But the fact of the matter is the temperature forecast on Thursday is in the upper 90s in that area of South Dakota. And that really gives us a concern about fire weather forecasts. We're already having trouble with some fires in Fall River County today. And the last thing we need is just hot, dry weather. But I do want to point that out, that there's some big differences East River versus West River when it comes to the humidity factor, especially later this week. And in fact, by Friday, not only is the humidity east, it actually goes back up a little bit for western South Dakota, which is a player in the possibility of a couple of thunderstorms. And that's something we'll have to kind of iron out as we go through the week. But I did want to kind of throw this out there as a starting point on talking about the weather, because anytime you start to enrich the atmosphere with more of that humidity, we definitely have the potential for thunderstorms. And even along with that, it is possible we could see some severe weather in that forecast later this week. And that's another subject I'm afraid we're going to have to address here as we go throughout the next couple of days. So we'll take a break, and we will pick up more details about that big weather pattern when we continue on Whether or Not. Stay with us. Welcome back to Whether or Not. I'm meteorologist Brian Karstens. So as we look at the pattern and dig into the details of the weather forecast, this is always an interesting time here to kind of have a little more of a weather discussion. I know some of you are really following the details closely as we round out the summer. So let's take a look at, first of all, how we're doing on this 30-day moving average of precipitation. So this gives us a good gauge on who has wet soils, who's drying out, and how that's changing over time. So it's pretty clear to see, first of all, that the majority of our viewing area is in the green or the blue colors. So that represents where we've had adequate moisture. Now, of course, I say the word adequate here. I'm actually talking relative to average. So July, now, of course, takes all of this in, plus the first few days of August. Typically, it can be a hotter time of the year. So we consume more water this time of the year when we look at the growing plants and vegetation. And there's obviously a natural tendency for those grasses, too, to begin to dry down. And our fire weather definitely goes hand in hand with that. So when we look at those parameters, especially where there's some yellow and orange showing up on those maps, that's where our concern continues to be. We've got drought that's ongoing in south central South Dakota. We've been talking about Fall River County today. There have been some fires, wildland fires there, and this environment continues to run some deficits. And any day that's in the 90s or worse is just contributing to that issue. Even if we can catch some thunderstorms, we're going through that water, too, pretty quickly. So just a quick update on that. Obviously, Sioux Falls has been doing pretty well relative to normal as of late. So what can change? What parameters do we see in the forecast? Well, this map here is an interesting one. If you really want to get into the details of this, this is actually the precipitable water map. Okay, that's a little bit of meteorology here. So basically what we're looking at is the depth of water content when we go from the surface and we're going up through the troposphere. So basically the layer of the atmosphere where all of the weather occurs. And so within that, you can obviously see areas painted in red and orange, and those are colors that indicate a higher depth of water content. And clearly, it's obvious you see a lot of that where? Over the tropics, right? The Gulf Coast, southern states, East Coast too. That makes a lot of sense when you think about where the deepest moisture in the atmosphere should be. But you'll also notice that there's some connection in KELOLAND. And even as we kick off this animation, you can see some of it across eastern South Dakota. That's actually where the depth of moisture is connected to some of those thunderstorms that we're tracking here in the forecast for late Wednesday night into early Thursday. And then as you see down the road here, and we'll get into the forecast, more of that tends to hang around again on Friday. It's somewhat disconnected from the depth of tropical moisture to our south, but notice that it continues a streak of moisture from South Dakota into Minnesota and the Great Lakes. So just acknowledging that lends itself to the fact that any thunderstorms that do develop within that zone can kind of tap into that moisture. It's also pretty obvious if you look at that big picture, look what's going on in the Atlantic Ocean. Well, we don't know yet how the tropics are going to fare, but the likelihood is that some tropical development is going to start to occur, and then those show up as those really large circulations, which on planet Earth, hurricanes are really good at distributing or redistributing energy, and one way we do that is through moisture content, as that's pulled out of the oceans and released into the atmosphere. So you get those huge circulations, and that's a map that actually really illustrates that very well when it comes to meteorology. Look at the depth of that out there. No word yet on how that's all going to, the specifics of that next week, but keep watching for more news on that subject. Notice how Sioux Falls, South Dakota kind of stands out, though. Yeah, we've got some orange, some depth of moisture here early next week. So be mindful of that as that area of high pressure to our south and east continues to pump some of that moisture in. It does look like there's a break, though, in some of that, maybe the middle of next week. This has been the typical pattern this summer. We've seen this kind of go back and forth. This boundary kind of waffles in here. I'm not surprised to see that trend at all. So that kind of gives us some evidence to support the fact that we're probably going to get some more rounds of thunderstorms. If we can get that in areas that need it the most, that would be very helpful to reduce some of those fire weather concerns. But again, those are interesting talking points. One other note here before we go to the next break here. I do want to bring up the discussion of severe weather. Storm Prediction Center this morning came out with their new outlook for Wednesday. It is a marginal risk. Now, this obviously can continue to change, so we'll continue to watch if that needs to be elevated a little bit. That'll depend on the concoction of heat and humidity and how that goes into that forecast. So, on that note, coming up next, we're going to take a closer look at the pattern in the forecast and give you some more specifics to think about when it comes to our weather. That's next. Stay with us. Welcome back to Weather or Not. I'm meteorologist Brian Karstens. So what is ahead with the forecast? Let's dig into a couple more details and a few maps that I like to show that discuss the bigger picture here across the country and how we kind of fit into that. It's always interesting to know that as these weather patterns move across the country, it affects our region, of course, in certain ways, and we can identify that as we look at the big picture. High pressure, that's that letter H that is spinning there in Arizona. That basically is the dome of heat. And remember, as the atmosphere heats up in the summertime, high pressure in the upper atmosphere is usually represents where the core of the heat is located. That's the depth of atmosphere as it expands due to hot air. Okay, so that kind of makes sense. You think hot air expands, cold air contracts as air molecules expand and contract due to temperature changes. And so that's what we watch. What's interesting here as we bring up the animation is you'll notice where that high pressure center is moving over time because it's not staying still. It's actually moving back to the east. And so as it sprawls out into Texas and portions of Oklahoma, Colorado, New Mexico, it is connected to the surging heat and local temperatures that we're experiencing in Keloland. And that's really important that we acknowledge that because initially, too, this is a dry heat for western South Dakota. And then what will happen is on the borderline where you get that little battle zone on the edge or rim of that heat, that's where those thunderstorms can develop. And that's exactly what the modeling is picking up on as we go into Wednesday night and early Thursday morning. Obviously, there are more details to kind of hammer out. We'll explore some of that here in just a moment. Then, what's next? Well, we're kind of in a westerly flow in the jet stream as we get through the rest of the week here. And so that puts us in a position where we can get some storms. Remember, last week we talked a lot about the cap on the atmosphere, and I explained that as the mid-level warmth, or you think of it basically as air that as it spreads across the plains, it puts in place a mechanism that helps to prevent or inhibit thunderstorm development. So the strength of that cap, how that's all calculated. There's a lot more to that, but I will say that there appears to be solid evidence that there will be some sort of a cap in place over parts of our region as we progress into Friday. I think that will play a role ultimately in some of the location parameters dealing with these storms. So do keep that in mind. Even though you're going to hear talk about storms, the placement of those storms is often the tricky part there, as we have to navigate those particulars. But as long as that high pressure is anchored to our south, it's going to keep our area kind of in that zone, that westerly or even maybe a southwesterly flow into Friday night. And if storms kick up in the Black Hills or western South Dakota Friday night, that could easily be a scenario where some of that rolls east-northeast and easily could entrain some severe weather in a scenario like that. In fact, as we're progressing into that time period, we're seeing a lot of evidence to suggest that dew points will be in the 70s, and with any kind of jet stream dynamics thrown in there, you bet. In fact, SPC has already talked about the potential to produce some severe weather here in the Northern Plains, but they've kind of refrained from any specific outlines just yet. And I would concur that that obviously is something we'll just have to continue to analyze as we get into the weekend. You notice that belt of rain, too, that tries to refire later in the weekend. That's a scenario Saturday night into Sunday. Tends to fire up storms from southern South Dakota into southern Minnesota, all the way into Michigan. And that is what we call the ring of fire. It goes right around the edge of that letter H where that circulation is. And that's, again, a classic mid to late summer pattern it's revisiting. And notice that the high pressure center actually moves back to the west early next week. And that's another telltale sign that we're going to have more movement of those storm complexes. The European model has been pretty consistent, both the deterministic, or what we consider the traditional operating mode of the model on producing storms here, and the artificial intelligence version has also been more active, the AI version of the models. So we've got a couple of different data points that we'll be watching, and I think that it's pretty safe to say that this pattern tends to cycle or repeat itself. And so that's kind of where we land about a week out from now, is about where we started. The wild card, it's worth mentioning, the tropics there, and there's definitely activity going on in the Atlantic. Much too early to call those details. But anybody that lives along the east coast of the country is obviously watching the forecast this time of year. And every day it's kicking out a little different solution on how to handle that. So obviously there'll be more to say in the coming days. All right. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap things up for today's program. We've had a good time visiting with you, myself at least today. Scott has the day off, but he is scheduled to join me again tomorrow here in the Storm Center. And of course, as we talk about the weather, we hope that you will take the time to check out what we have to say about the weather and the forecast. For now, I'm meteorologist Brian Karstens. Thank you for watching and have a great day.